She vanished without a trace. 43 years passed and everyone gave up. But then a single phone call shattered decades of silence. Her daughter's killer was alive, and no one expected who he was. This is the story of one mother's unimaginable grief, the truth that refused to stay buried, and a fight for justice that would change hundreds of lives. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because these untold stories deserve to be heard. And tell me in the comments, if someone disappeared in your town and the case went cold for decades, would you ever stop hoping for answers? She had been gone for 43 years. Not missing for days or months but decades. Everyone else had moved on. Everyone except Margaret Anderson. Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once raised a happy, lively daughter. The walls were the same, the clock still ticking, but the laughter had long since vanished. Her hands hovered over a faded photograph of Sarah, just 17 when she disappeared in 1978. Sarah had been bright, full of life, the kind of girl who could light up a room with a single smile. That summer evening she had told her mother she was going to the movies with friends. She never came home. No note. No call. Just a disappearance that left a gaping void in Margaret's life and in her heart. For years, Margaret had lived in a haze of unanswered questions. Neighbors stopped inviting her to gatherings not out of malice, but because they didn't know how to face her grief. Some whispered that Sarah had run away to California. Others suggested she had fallen in with the wrong crowd. A few even cruelly hinted that she had somehow brought it upon herself. Margaret never believed any of it. She only believed in the quiet ache of not knowing, a pain that grew heavier with each passing year. Her husband John passed away long before any answers arrived, leaving Margaret alone in the house where they had raised Sarah. The world outside moved on, but Margaret's life was suspended in time, a single chapter frozen in grief. Then the phone rang. It was an ordinary ring, nothing remarkable, but to Margaret, it shattered decades of silence. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't dared to hope in years. Every unanswered question, every night spent staring at the ceiling imagining what had happened, every hollow moment of despair, it all condensed into this one instant. On the other end of the line, a voice, calm, steady, and yet heavy with the weight of a lifetime, spoke words that seemed impossible. "We found him. Robert Carmichael. He's still alive." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. Her knees threatened to buckle. 43 years of grief, doubt, and longing crashed over her at once. Hope, long dormant, stirred for the first time in decades. Sarah's disappearance had been treated like a small-town tragedy at first. Police combed the streets, canvassed neighborhoods, questioned friends, and checked alibis. But leads ran dry, tips turned cold, and by 1985, her case was buried in a filing cabinet, forgotten, lost to time. Detective Ethan Lawson, the man who had first investigated Sarah's case, had retired defeated years later, carrying her face in his dreams, her youthful smile frozen in a nightmarish memory that refused to fade. Now, decades later, something had changed. Technology that hadn't existed in the 1970s, DNA testing, national databases, modern forensic science, breathed life into the old files. What had been overlooked for decades was now revealed with chilling clarity. The man responsible for Sarah's death had been identified. Margaret's body shook as the truth sank in. For 43 years, her daughter's life had been stolen, and the silence of that crime had hung over her like a storm cloud. And now, at long last, she had a name. This wasn't the closure she had imagined, not peace, not comfort. But it was something far more powerful. It was the breaking of silence. The unanswered questions that had haunted her for decades were finally moving toward answers. Margaret clung to the phone, her knuckles white. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. Tell me everything." For the first time in more than 4 decades, the long night of uncertainty had begun to end. The call that shattered decades of grief would change not only Margaret's life, but the lives of countless families still waiting for justice. And in that moment, Margaret realized something she hadn't dared to believe for decades. Hope wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. Sarah had vanished one summer night, just a teenager with dreams bigger than her small town. Her life was stolen in a moment that no one saw coming. For decades the world moved on, but not Margaret. She remembered every detail, every fleeting memory, every laugh that had once filled the house. Detective Ethan Lawson had been there from the start, walking the same streets, knocking on the same doors, following every lead. He had retired years ago, carrying the burden of failure like a shadow. But now, in his 70s, he was back, drawn into the case by one spark of possibility: DNA. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences had begun revisiting cold cases using technology that had once been unimaginable. And somewhere in those decades-old files, hidden among faded photographs and typed reports, Ethan found it: a partial DNA profile. Incomplete, fragmented, but enough. Enough to open a door that had been closed for 43 years. Weeks later, the match appeared. Robert Carmichael. A quiet man, unassuming, living a seemingly ordinary life in Nashville, Tennessee. He had worked in the same hospital for nearly 20 years. He had no criminal record. No hint of the monster hidden in plain sight. He was the last person anyone would suspect. Margaret listened to the detective's words over the phone, gripping the receiver as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "We found him. We found the man who killed Sarah." Her hands shook. Her body went cold. The years of pain, of waiting, of imagining every possible scenario, surged to the surface in a tidal wave. The killer wasn't gone. He hadn't been punished. He had walked free, living a life untouched by the secret he carried. And yet there was more. As Ethan described Carmichael's life, the ordinary details became eerily sinister. The weekend volunteer work, the classical music records, the quiet dinners alone. A life carefully constructed to hide a darkness buried decades ago. Margaret felt a shiver of dread. The questions she had spent years imagining, the who, the why, the how, were about to collide with reality. The man who had taken her daughter from her was more human than she could have anticipated. More terrifyingly normal. And then came the moment that no one could have prepared for. The moment that would change everything. Ethan hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something you need to know about that night, Margaret. Something we never uncovered before. Something Robert left behind." Margaret's heart stopped. Her breath caught. 43 years of waiting, of imagining, of fearing, led to this single moment of revelation. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan paused, and on the other end of the line, the silence stretched longer than she could bear. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "You're not going to believe this, but we think he's kept a secret all these years. One that could change everything we thought we knew about Sarah's disappearance." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. Secret. After 43 years, there was still something more. Something dark. Something waiting to be uncovered. And in that instant, Margaret realized that the answers she had longed for her entire life were still only halfway revealed. The truth was closer than ever, but it was far from complete. The past wasn't done with them yet. Robert Carmichael had lived for decades like a ghost hiding in plain sight. To everyone around him, he was ordinary, quiet, dependable, unremarkable. He worked at a hospital, volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends, and spent evenings alone listening to classical music. A life so routine, so innocuous, that no one could imagine the darkness that had slept behind it for 43 years. But Detective Ethan Lawson knew better. He had spent days combing through old police files, photographs, witness statements, and interviews, piecing together fragments of a story that had haunted him for decades. Each paper, each faded photograph, was a reminder of Sarah, her laughter, her energy, her life stolen in a single summer night. And now, after decades of dead ends, the puzzle had a piece that fit: Carmichael. When Carmichael was brought in for questioning, he maintained a calm, almost rehearsed composure. His denial was immediate, smooth, and chillingly casual. "I've never been to Huntsville. I don't know Sarah Anderson. This DNA must be a mistake." But the evidence was unyielding. DNA, the technological leap that hadn't existed in 1978, pointed to him. Every file Ethan had meticulously reconstructed, every lead revisited with modern eyes, all converged on Robert Carmichael. The first cracks in Carmichael's composure were subtle: flickers of hesitation, a slight pause, a tightening of the jaw. Ethan pressed on, patient but unrelenting. It began to emerge. In the summer of 1978, Carmichael was 18, visiting a cousin in Huntsville. That night he had seen Sarah at a gas station, vibrant, carefree, laughing with friends. Something inside him stirred. Jealousy, envy, fascination. No one could explain it fully. All anyone could know was that he followed her into the night, unseen, with no plan beyond wanting to be near her, to see her, to control the uncontrollable spark of life that Sarah carried. When she screamed and tried to run, something broke within him. Rage overtook reason. He chased her into the shadows, and in the chaos of that night, a young girl's life was stolen forever. He buried her in a ravine, covering her with dirt and branches, and returned home as if nothing had happened, his life seemingly untouched by the horror he had committed. For 43 years, Carmichael lived a life of quiet normalcy. Yet the secret never left him. Every day he was haunted, by memory, by guilt, by the impossible weight of knowing he had destroyed a life. The ordinary acts of his life, volunteering, working, reading, became a mask, a way to coexist with his conscience. But Ethan Lawson could see through the mask. He could feel the tension in every lie, the hesitancy in every response, the silent confession that lingered in the air. Margaret Anderson watched the interrogation footage from her apartment, hands trembling, stomach twisting with anticipation and dread. Every word spoken, every detail revealed, cut deeper than she could have imagined. 43 years of unanswered questions, of imagining every possible scenario, were colliding with a reality far darker than she had ever dared picture. Then came the moment that made her blood run cold. Ethan leaned forward in the interrogation room, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Robert, there's something else. Something we just discovered. Something from that night that no one has ever seen." Carmichael's eyes flickered, the first real crack in his carefully constructed facade. For a moment, vulnerability, or perhaps fear, flashed across his face. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight, almost fragile. Ethan pulled out a file, the contents obscured from the cameras. "There's evidence that suggests you weren't acting alone." Margaret's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. 43 years of grief, of imagining closure, of waiting, were now confronted with a new, terrifying reality. The man she had longed to see punished, the shadow who haunted her dreams for decades, might not have been alone. Someone else could have been involved. Someone who had disappeared into the past, leaving only questions behind. And just like that, the story she thought she knew, the story that had defined her life for decades, was about to unravel. The truth she had waited 43 years to hear was no longer simple. It was more sinister, more complicated, and far more chilling than she could have ever imagined. Who else had been involved? And could the secret of that night be even darker than Margaret or anyone had feared? The past was not done with them. Not yet. The interrogation room was deceptively quiet. A single harsh fluorescent light cast long shadows across the walls, highlighting the gray in Detective Ethan Lawson's hair and the deep lines etched into Robert Carmichael's face. For decades, that room had held criminals who tried to hide behind lies. But none like him. None who had lived for over 40 years with such a secret buried deep inside. Carmichael's hands trembled ever so slightly as he clasped them together on the cold metal table. The weight of the past hung heavily in the air. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady, measured, but filled with the quiet fire of a man who had never stopped seeking the truth. "Robert, the DNA doesn't lie. All the evidence points to you. You can either tell us what happened or the truth will speak for itself." Carmichael's gaze fell to the table. For a long moment he did not respond, his breathing shallow, almost as if each inhale was a battle. Then in a voice soft but chilling he began. I saw her at the gas station. Sarah, she was laughing with her friends. So alive, so free. Something inside me broke that night. I didn't plan it. I didn't intend for it to happen. But when she ran, when she screamed, I couldn't stop myself. The words hung in the room like smoke. In Margaret Anderson's apartment, she gripped her chair as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. 43 years of unanswered questions, endless nights replaying what-ifs, had led to this very moment. The details of her daughter's last night were finally being revealed. And yet, the relief she had imagined was replaced by something far heavier: shock, rage, and an almost unbearable grief. Carmichael's confession continued, each word more haunting than the last. I grabbed her. She fought, she screamed, she begged. I couldn't think. And then it was over. I buried her in a ravine behind the gas station. Covered her with dirt and branches. I came back like nothing had happened. For years. I thought I could live with it, that my guilt was punishment enough. But it never went away. Ethan's hand tightened around the file in front of him. He had confronted killers before, but Carmichael's calm, detached way of recounting the murder made the horror almost surreal. This wasn't a monster in the shadows. It was someone who looked ordinary, lived ordinary, yet had committed something incomprehensible. Margaret's mind raced. How could someone live a normal life for over 4 decades after taking the life of her child? How could he smile, volunteer, go to work, and appear harmless, while the truth of that night remained locked away inside him? And then came the words that froze everyone in the room. There was someone else that night. I didn't act alone. I don't know if anyone else remembers, but I can't say more. Not yet. Margaret's breath caught in her chest. Her daughter's killer might have had an accomplice. The nightmare she thought had ended was suddenly far from over. Ethan leaned back in his chair, mind racing. If Carmichael wasn't alone, the question became not just who else had been there, but how many other secrets had remained hidden for over 40 years. And what kind of darkness was still lurking, waiting to be uncovered. Meanwhile, Carmichael slumped slightly in his chair, a shadow of the man he had once been. I've lived with this every day. I've tried to atone in my own way. But it's never enough. The guilt, it never leaves. Margaret felt the familiar grip of despair, the hollow ache she had carried for decades. But under that grief, a spark of determination flared. She had endured too much, fought too long, and Sarah's story wasn't finished. As the interrogation drew to a close, Ethan left Carmichael staring at the floor, his confession hanging in the air like a curse. Margaret knew with a cold certainty that the past had more to reveal. The unanswered question lingered. Who else was involved that night? And could the next revelation finally bring justice? Or uncover a darkness far worse than anyone could imagine? The past was far from finished, and Margaret realized this was only the beginning. The confession left a chilling silence in the interrogation room. Carmichael's words echoed in Detective Ethan Lawson's mind. There was someone else that night. For Margaret, every fiber of her being went taut. Could it be true? Could there really be another person involved in the night Sarah disappeared? 43 years of unanswered questions suddenly seemed smaller compared to this new, terrifying revelation. Back in Huntsville, the cold case unit sprang into motion. Ethan pored over every detail from the 1978 investigation. Old police reports, witness statements, photographs of Sarah at the gas station, and notes from interviews that had long been dismissed. Something minor, overlooked at the time, now seemed to shimmer with significance. Margaret sat in her apartment staring at the old newspaper clippings taped to her walls, each headline a frozen scream of loss. Teen girl vanishes in Huntsville. Search for Sarah Anderson continues. No leads in 1978 cold case. Her eyes lingered on a photograph of Sarah, smiling, carefree, her youth untainted. Could that smile have been the last anyone would see before darkness descended? Ethan dialed a number he hadn't used in decades, an old colleague who had been on the original investigation. If there's anyone who might know about accomplices, it's the people who were there at the time, he said, voice tight with urgency. Meanwhile, Carmichael remained in custody, his demeanor shifting between resignation and defiance. Every so often he muttered fragments, words that sounded like clues, but before Ethan could press him he fell silent again. It was as if he was teasing the truth, holding it just out of reach. Ethan's investigation turned up something curious. A name mentioned in an overlooked witness statement, a man who had been at the gas station that night, a friend of Carmichael's cousin. At the time, police dismissed him. He claimed he had no connection to Sarah. But now, in the light of Carmichael's confession, Ethan couldn't ignore it. Margaret, sensing the rising tension, called Ethan. Is there another person? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know yet, he admitted. But there's a thread we can't ignore. And I think following it might change everything we thought we knew about that night. The search intensified. Leads were pulled from decades-old filing cabinets. Phone records, neighborhood rumors, and forgotten names were cross-referenced against modern databases. DNA evidence from the crime scene already linked to Carmichael was re-examined, this time searching for any hint of another contributor. Days turned into nights, and Margaret felt the familiar ache of waiting for answers. The silence of her apartment, once comforting in its solitude, now felt oppressive. Each phone ring made her heart leap with hope and fear. Then came the breakthrough. A partial DNA sample, small but significant, surfaced from evidence previously deemed inconclusive. It didn't match Carmichael, but it hinted at someone else. Someone who had been there the night Sarah vanished. Ethan studied the results, brow furrowed. "We're close," he muttered. "Closer than we've ever been." Margaret clutched her hands together, praying. 43 years of unanswered questions had led to this moment, and now the shadows of that night were starting to move, revealing secrets that had been buried for decades. But even as hope sparked, fear loomed larger. Who had been with Carmichael that night? And were they still out there living free while Sarah's family waited for justice? One thing was certain: the story wasn't over. Not even close. The partial DNA sample was more than a clue. It was a door creaking open on a night that had remained locked for 43 years. Ethan Lawson studied the lab results, his eyes narrowing as the sequence of alleles pointed to someone who had been at the scene with Carmichael. Someone who had slipped through the cracks all these decades. Margaret's hands trembled as Ethan called. "Margaret, it's not just Carmichael. There's someone else. Someone who was there that night." Margaret froze. 43 years of grief, of unanswered questions, suddenly twisted into a new nightmare. Another person, another secret buried in the shadows of that night? Ethan began compiling everything known about the accomplice. His real name, Danny Whitaker. A cousin of Carmichael's, he was 18 at the time, living in Huntsville for the summer. On paper, Danny was ordinary, quiet, well-mannered, and eager to fit in, but beneath that facade lay a temperament no one had noticed until it was too late. Danny had been at the gas station the night Sarah disappeared, chatting casually with Carmichael. Witnesses at the time had dismissed his presence as coincidental. He was just another teenager on a summer evening. But DNA evidence now proved he had touched Sarah, just enough for a trace to survive 4 decades in the ravine where her body had been buried. Further digging revealed unsettling details about his life after 1978. Danny had moved west to Nevada, far from Huntsville. He changed his name legally in the 1980s and built a life as a quiet factory worker, never attracting suspicion. No criminal record, no arrests, no hint of violence. But his connection to that fateful night had gone unnoticed, buried by time and misfortune. Ethan obtained old photographs, comparing them to modern surveillance footage and social media images. Even at 63, Danny's features were recognizable. The same eyes, the same subtle expressions, but decades older, the weight of time settling in. Ethan's team traced his employment, volunteers and neighbors, noting that, like Carmichael, he had blended into society so completely that no one ever suspected him. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She replayed Sarah's last moments in her mind. The laughter, the carefree steps toward the gas station, the girl who never came home. And now, knowing there was another person involved, she felt both relief and horror. Relief that the truth was closer than ever. Horror that someone had shared in the darkness that stole her daughter. Ethan prepared a detailed report for the district attorney. Profile of Daniel Whitaker. Age in 1978, 18. Present age, 63. Occupation, retired factory worker, never had criminal convictions. Relationship to primary suspect, cousin of Robert Carmichael. DNA evidence, partial match from crime scene, confirms physical contact with victim. Behavioral notes, quiet, unremarkable lifestyle, no prior indications of violent tendencies. Historical record, known to be at gas station with Carmichael night of disappearance. Overlooked in 1978 due to assumption of innocence. Ethan's plan was precise. Danny had to be located before any chance of flight. Surveillance, social media, and public records narrowed his location to a small Nevada town. For the first time in over 40 years, the accomplice's shadow began to take shape in the real world. Margaret, clutching her daughter's old photograph, whispered to herself, "It's finally coming. We will know. We will find the truth." And yet, even with the accomplice identified, the looming question remained. Would confronting Danny bring closure, or open wounds even deeper than before? The clock was ticking and every moment heightened the tension. One wrong move could mean another decades-old secret would vanish forever. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beneath the fading sun as Ethan Lawson and his small team closed in on Danny Whitaker. After decades of hiding in plain sight, Danny had built a quiet life, but the past doesn't stay buried forever. Ethan's heart pounded as he prepared to confront a man who had shared a night of unspeakable violence, a man who had never faced justice. Every detail in the files, the photographs, the DNA evidence, the witness statements, pointed to the truth that had long eluded him. Danny's small house was unremarkable. Beige siding, a neatly trimmed lawn, a single rusted mailbox. Nothing in the exterior betrayed the storm brewing inside. Ethan knocked, a calm but firm presence. The door opened and there he was, Danny, looking older, frail in posture, but with the same unremarkable demeanor he'd carried for decades. "Mr. Whitaker," Ethan began, his voice steady, "we need to talk about the summer of 1978, about Sarah Mitchell." Danny's face went pale, but he didn't run. Instead, a strange stillness filled the air, a quiet tension that made the moment almost unbearable. For a heartbeat, the years seemed to collapse into that one summer night. I don't know what you're talking about," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. But his eyes betrayed the flicker of panic, the guilt he had carried silently for 43 years. Ethan laid out the evidence, piece by painstaking piece. DNA samples, witness statements, and the connections to Carmichael. He spoke slowly, deliberately, giving Danny no room to deny what was undeniable. Danny's facade began to crumble. First, it was a tremor in his hands. Then the twitch of an eye. Finally, words spilled out, uncoordinated and raw. "I didn't mean for it. It just happened. I was there. I didn't stop him. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." The confession was jagged, incomplete, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Ethan listened carefully, recording every detail. 43 years of silence had ended in this quiet, tremulous admission. Margaret, still in Huntsville, waited for updates, her hands clutching Sarah's photo. When she heard the words, "We have him," a wave of emotion swept over her. Relief, horror, anger, all mingled into a complex, suffocating weight. Danny Whitaker had been part of the darkness that stole Sarah. Not the one who acted alone, but the one who silently enabled it. And in that silence, Margaret understood something crucial. The tragedy of her daughter's death had many layers, many hidden faces. As Danny was taken into custody, Ethan reflected on the human capacity for hidden darkness, and Margaret on the resilience it took to finally confront it. But even as justice moved forward, one question lingered in every mind. Why had Danny stayed silent all these years? What fear, what shame had chained him to that secret for over 4 decades? The answer would emerge in Part 8. But for now, the shadow of that summer night had been exposed, leaving both Margaret and the viewers on the edge of revelation. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel borrowed. For 43 years, Margaret Anderson had carried Sarah's absence like a stone in her heart. Now she sat at the front row, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Across the room, Robert Carmichael and Danny Whitaker were seated in separate areas, both men older, quieter, and yet fully aware of the weight finally catching up to them. They had spent decades blending into ordinary life, hiding behind mundane routines, but the truth had finally tracked them down. The trial began with the methodical presentation of evidence: DNA, photographs, witness statements, and a chilling timeline meticulously reconstructed by Detective Ethan Lawson. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of the night Sarah Mitchell vanished, a life stolen in an instant. The room fell silent as Ethan recounted the discovery of Sarah's remains and the painstaking unraveling of the 43-year-old mystery. When the prosecution called Carmichael to testify, Margaret felt her stomach tighten. The man who had ended her daughter's life stared down at the floor, eyes hollow yet aware of the legacy of pain he had created. Then came Danny Whitaker's testimony, a mixture of hesitation, fear, and confession. I was there," Danny admitted, voice shaking. "I didn't stop him. I was scared. I've lived with this guilt every day since." Margaret felt a surge of emotion that almost knocked her from her seat. For decades she had carried not just the grief of Sarah's loss, but the gnawing question of how anyone could allow such evil to go unchecked. Now she had her answer, but it was not enough to bring immediate peace. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired. Margaret walked outside into the crisp air, the Alaska-like chill of Huntsville in her bones, and reflected on everything she had endured. Years of unanswered questions, whispers of blame, and the isolation that had followed her through life, All of it led to this moment. When the jury returned, the verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. Justice, delayed for decades, had finally arrived. Margaret's hands trembled as she absorbed the words, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't a return of her daughter, nor could it ever erase the years of pain, but it was a crack in the wall that had imprisoned her grief for over 40 years. After the verdict, Margaret requested a private meeting with both Carmichael and Whitaker. Standing before the two men, her voice was steady, piercing through the decades of silence. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying this rage will not bring my daughter back. Sarah's life deserves more than vengeance. Her memory deserves to be honored." Her words hung in the air, a mixture of grief, strength, and unflinching resolve. For a moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a space of reckoning, where decades of injustice, silence, and pain were finally confronted. But even as justice was served, Margaret knew her fight was far from over. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation would continue to push forward, helping families who were still waiting decades for answers. Each case she reopened became a promise that no victim would be forgotten, and no family would endure the silence she had lived with for 43 long years. And yet, as Margaret left the courthouse that day, a quiet thought lingered. The system had finally delivered justice for her daughter, but how many others were still waiting? How many voices were still unheard, lost in files gathering dust, waiting for someone to care? The answer would drive Margaret's next move, a mission that would transform her grief into a movement that no one could ignore. Margaret Anderson stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of decades pressing down on her, but this time it was a different kind of weight. It wasn't just grief, it was purpose. For 43 years she had carried the absence of her daughter like a shadow. Now she realized that shadow could light the path for others still lost in darkness. Back in her Huntsville apartment, Margaret began sorting through decades of files, photographs, and letters. Evidence of unresolved cases that had been forgotten, dismissed, or abandoned. She wasn't just seeing paper. She was seeing stories frozen in time, lives left incomplete, families still waiting for answers. With Ethan Lawson by her side, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. They would create a foundation, not just for Sarah but for every victim whose life had been cut short, whose story had been buried in silence. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Cold Case Resolution was born. The first months were grueling. Margaret sold her house and tapped into her savings, determined to fund the foundation herself. Volunteers arrived. Students, retired investigators, forensic enthusiasts, all driven by the desire to right wrongs long ignored. Margaret pored over old case files, connecting DNA leads with witness accounts, revisiting every abandoned investigation with fresh eyes and modern technology. The first breakthrough came within 6 months. A case from the late 1970s, a missing young woman from Mississippi, was reopened. DNA evidence, long thought useless, finally gave her family the answers they had waited decades for. Margaret watched as tears streamed down the mother's face, a grief transformed at last into closure. The foundation's reputation grew quickly. Families of the missing reached out from across the country, desperate for help, desperate for hope. Margaret listened to every story, held every hand, offered comfort that only someone who had lived the torment of decades-long uncertainty could provide. But success brought challenges. Some families whose cases weren't yet solved expressed resentment. Questions arose. Was Margaret using Sarah's case to gain attention? Did her resources give her an unfair advantage? Margaret faced the scrutiny head-on, determined to prove that her mission was about justice, not recognition. Through it all, she remained resolute. She knew firsthand the human cost of unresolved cases. She had lived it. And now, she would ensure that others wouldn't have to endure the same silent suffering. By the end of the first year, the foundation had reopened 43 cold cases. 12 showed promising leads. 5 families finally had closure, their pain acknowledged, their loved ones remembered. And for Margaret, every solved case was a small victory, not just for the families but for the memory of her daughter, Sarah. Yet even amidst these early victories, Margaret couldn't shake a sobering truth. Justice in America had not always been equal. Many unsolved cases involved victims from marginalized communities, overlooked by a system that had historically valued some lives more than others. Margaret knew that the next chapter of the foundation would have to confront this inequality directly. As she stood by the window of her apartment that night, looking out over the quiet streets of Huntsville, Margaret made a silent promise. She would use the foundation to shine a light on the forgotten, the ignored, the voiceless. Sarah's story would not only bring closure for those she loved, but justice for those who never had a chance. The work of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation had begun, but this was only the beginning. The path ahead would be long, challenging, and at times exhausting. But Margaret's resolve was unshakable. She had transformed grief into purpose, and in doing so she was about to change the lives of hundreds, even thousands across the nation. Years passed, but Margaret Mitchell never slowed. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation grew from a small apartment operation into a national powerhouse, changing the way law enforcement approached cold cases. What had started as a personal quest for closure had become a movement, a revolution in justice for the forgotten. By the fifth year, the foundation had solved over 400 cold cases. Families who had spent decades in limbo finally had answers. Graves that had been empty for years were filled. Stories that had been silenced were now told aloud. Every solved case was a victory, not just for the family, but for the principles Margaret had fought to uphold: dignity, remembrance, and equality. But Margaret's work also revealed the deep flaws in the system. She saw that cases involving marginalized communities, Black, Indigenous, and low-income victims, had often been ignored. She realized justice had not been blind. It had been selective. And so she made a bold decision. The foundation would focus on those who had historically been overlooked. Resources were reallocated. Investigators from affected communities were hired. Partnerships were forged with advocacy groups fighting systemic injustice. Critics questioned her motives. Some whispered that her shift in focus was publicity or guilt. Margaret didn't respond publicly, she let her results speak. Lives were being restored, families were finally grieving instead of searching, and forgotten victims were being remembered. Margaret's tireless work earned recognition. She received the National Medal of Justice from the President of the United States. At the White House ceremony, she spoke not only about her daughter, Sarah, but about every family still waiting for answers. She told the crowd, "Every cold case matters. Every life mattered. No one should ever be forgotten." Even as her body aged, Margaret's mind remained sharp. At 95, she was still actively mentoring investigators, training law enforcement, and advocating for victims' families. She inspired a new generation, including her great-great-granddaughter Sophie, who would follow in her footsteps, carrying the torch of justice forward. When Margaret passed at the age of 118, the foundation was stronger than ever. Her legacy was immortal, not only in the hundreds of lives she had touched but in the systemic change she had created. Cold cases were no longer filed away and forgotten. They were treated with urgency, empathy, and modern forensic science. Decades later, the foundation continued to thrive. New satellite offices opened nationwide, investigators were trained, and technologies once unimaginable in Margaret's youth were now standard tools for solving cold cases. Margaret's story and Sarah's story became a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the power of one person's determination to transform grief into action. A statue was erected in front of the foundation's headquarters, depicting Margaret holding the hand of a young girl, standing tall and unwavering. The plaque read, "Margaret Mitchell, 1926 to 2044. She transformed grief into justice. She refused to let the forgotten be forgotten. One person's determination can change everything." As Sophie stood beside the statue with her own daughter, she whispered a promise. "We will continue this fight. Every life will be remembered. Every family will have answers." And so, the work of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation continued, proving that even the darkest moments of grief can be transformed into light. That one mother's unwavering love for her daughter could ignite a nationwide movement. That justice, no matter how delayed, could still be delivered. Sarah Mitchell, once 17, became immortal, not through her years, but through the impact her story had on the world. And Margaret Mitchell, the mother who refused to let her daughter be forgotten, became a testament to the enduring power of human determination, compassion, and hope. The story doesn't end here. There are still families waiting, still victims forgotten, still cold cases gathering dust. But thanks to Margaret, there is a path forward. A path where no one has to wait decades for justice. Where grief can be transformed into purpose. Where every life matters. Sarah Mitchell's story is a powerful reminder that no life should ever be forgotten, and that even the deepest grief can be transformed into justice. Margaret Mitchell showed us that one person's determination can change the world, and it's up to all of us to keep their stories alive. If you were moved by this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another untold story of justice, mystery, and resilience. Share this video with someone who believes in fighting for the forgotten, and comment below what story you want us to uncover next. Every voice counts, and together we can make sure no case is ever left unsolved. Thank you for watching Untold Stories by Celine. Remember, justice may be delayed, but it can never be denied.